Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Miller, and I'm here to present on the case study for Black Lives Matter. To summarize the case study, there's a Black Lives Matter activist that organized a protest a few blocks away from a high school. The protest occurred towards the end of the day, right where rush hour begins. Students are loading on the bus, parents are picking up from school, students are starting to drive home at the end of the school day. Of course, with the protest that was taking place, buses were running late, which caused traffic to be backed up, and students weren't able to get home on the estimated time of arrival. The effect of that, parents were frustrated, frustrated with the protesters, and because it caused buses to be running late towards the end of the day. They were also upset with the community members as well as to why this was possibly taking place at the end of the day near a school setting. Social media was a platform that was used, of course, to expose the Black Lives Matter activists during their protests. With social media being used as a platform, of course, that is accessible to anybody and everybody, including the students. Students were then, following the next school day, wearing T-shirts that were Black Lives Matter stated on the front, and students were also wearing other shirts that had All Lives Matter. Mrs. Simmons, the assistant superintendent, wanted to encourage the conversation about protests. Of course, there were other superintendents, district leaders, high school principals that discouraged it. Of course, following that piece, Mrs. Simmons decided to ignore her colleagues' recommendations and looked at developing and creating a curriculum and guidelines for students and teachers to follow this type of situation. Legal and ethical matters. Of course, there's always legal issues. We want to make sure we're following policy and Board of Education policy, district policies. The protest was legally sound. It was peacefully organized. There was no hate happening during this time. But with that, we want to make sure that safety and traffic concerns are definitely an issue for all people involved. Mrs. Simmons wanted to make sure that when she's doing this is following district protocol, like I said, and policies that have been approved by the Board of Education on an issue like this. But like I said, there has been no legal issues that have occurred in the school yet because of this situation. I'm really looking at what happened overall. There, like I said, as stated at the beginning of this, there were Black Lives Matter protests that were peacefully organized in the community to raise awareness on this issue. People viewed it as different, of course. There's different sides to this viewpoint. But really transporting students from high school and the issues continuing into the next school day with students wearing the different types of T-shirts were clearly divided, and Mrs. Simmons searched for ways to advocate for a supportive and inclusive learning environment. To go further into the facts of this case study, again, it was a school district. Looking at the whole school district, superintendent was Mrs. Simmons, one of the main characters in this case study. We have multiple district administrators, staff, students, high school principals, and also community stakeholders such as the external stakeholders, businesses, families, and the organization in this matter would be Black Lives Matter organization. The place that occurred was a high school. The site of the high school is really kind of unknown, but from the way it sounds, it took place more of an urban school district or community. And the program, really a public school setting. Mrs. Simmons is starting to look at curriculum and handbook policies and procedures to help deal with this type of thing more just better, in a better way, and impacting the entire high school. Really to look at when I'm reviewing and to prioritize the information, looking at as building leaders or as district leaders, you want to make sure you're looking at lists of assumptions going through this piece, but really the damaging results by the situation that's taking place with the protest occurring. Of course, there's always the issue of racism. There's a bunch of conflict and divide of students wearing the two different shirts of All Lives Matters versus Black Lives Matters. Parents complaining about the decisiveness between this, the divisionness between the two different types of shirts, and Mrs. Simmons ignoring her colleagues. Mrs. Simmons ignoring the colleagues and their opinion in this could have a longer lasting damage to this piece. I'm not sure in the case today, again, it's unknown of the professional collaboration between her colleagues in this piece. Questions that I would like to ask as a leader would, with this protest occurring and possibly again in the near future, what kind of impact will this have on students? Each and every day we need to reflect on what kind of impact we're having on students as we enter the building, and everything and every decision we make should reflect student outcomes or student impact on students. Mrs. Simmons is starting to create and look at a handbook, student and teacher handbook. I would question, is she doing this by herself, or is she creating a committee to work through this handbook and really review the policy and procedures? Questions. Mrs. Simmons ignored her colleagues, so what are some consequences if she wasn't following board policy or district policy on matters like this that may already be in place? Excuse me. And then also to continue to support that inclusive district culture across the district. How can we create this, continue to build on it, and it be sustained? Options and consequences, again, looking at if no actions were taking place, this kind of divide would continue possibly and get worse throughout the building or the district. So we wanted to make sure we keep a close eye on that if no actions were taking place. That inclusive culture that we've created across our district is not being groomed and sustained. Allowing Mrs. Simmons to construct this informative curriculum, this handbook that she's wanting to review for the student-teacher handbook to go through these types of protests and matters. Advocating for equitable access to safe and nurturing schools and resources. So really this is a big piece of that student handbook, teacher handbook, is how are we continuing to advocate for schools and resources of this matter. And the biggest thing, again, is collective efficacy, and that collective effort by Mrs. Simmons and the work group that she may be working with to create and support the district culture. With that, the consequence of creating that and having a committee that would work through that process would be the district resources, policies, and procedures that are already being evaluated or evaluated within our current structure. And then the biggest piece, the collective collaboration, to continue to sustain that inclusive working collective and school culture. We want to make sure everyone's collaborating and everyone's on the same page. Evaluating the options, looking at this. Again, if no decisions were made, of course, there's a lot of stakeholders, external stakeholders, internal stakeholders could be impacted by this and very, very frustrated. The cultural responsiveness is not being attended to or reviewed across the district, therefore it's not being sustained. Mrs. Simmons is allowing her to construct this curriculum, having some sort of audit or guideline for her to work through with her committee, such as a rubric to vet the possible guidelines and options and standards we need to follow as a district to continue advocating for a safe and nurturing school. Cultural responsiveness, as we've created this in our district, we want to continue to create this, but with this situation, we want to make sure that if we're reviewing this handbook, we're reviewing that policy, those procedures, and it's consistent across our entire district. The collective collaboration, the collective efficacy that we're building throughout our district, throughout our buildings, throughout our community is positive. And we want to make sure that everybody is on board with this process and these procedures. And again, ensuring that our cultural responsiveness that we've put in practice and play across our district is consistent. Best options, again, that collective efforts put in by Mrs. Simmons, the district administrators, and a committee going through the handbooks, policies, and procedures, and possibly later on bringing in the Board of Education and really making sure that we are doing what's best for our students in our school district, but also being prepared for these types of situations when they arise. How do we handle them, and what is the order and chain and in which we do that? Teachers, students, staff, they're going to have a higher collective efficacy and to work together. Mrs. Simmons' voice is being heard, and she is continuing to lead an inclusive and supportive community for our district and for our community. There's going to be strict guidelines put in place for student and teacher handbooks. This could be created by Mrs. Simmons and that work group to really ensure that everyone's following the procedures and processes put in place to sustain equity, inclusiveness, and being culturally responsive across our district. Really looking at imagining the implementation of this, we want to make sure that the committee created by Mrs. Simmons supports all these ideas. She'd be able to facilitate a group of internal stakeholders and a variety of opinions about racism and creating an equitable, inclusive, and culturally responsive school district. Like we've said in the past slides, she's continuing to look at curriculum and guidelines for student and teacher handbook. This could be an annual process for her and the committee to review and make sure that it's up to date for these types of situations. Once this handbook is in place and revisions of the handbook are made, proper protocols can be worked on and would need to occur. Like I said, how do we leverage this across our entire district, ensure that everybody across our district's using it and how they use it? And then the biggest piece with this, like I said, how are they using it would require some professional development. What kind of professional development are we using to help bring light to our new student and teacher handbook? These curriculum guidelines we put in place to help educate or teach around this topic of cultural responsiveness throughout our entire school district. Again, thank you for listening. My name is Brandon Miller. If you have any questions, please comment. Thank you.